Hello and welcome to my presentation. My name is Adam Poole and I'm an independent researcher based in Shanghai, China. The focus of my presentation today is on international school teachers' short-term contracts. I'll begin by situating short-term contracts within the notion of international school precarity. International schools are often depicted as tense and messy places, being inherently anomalous. Caffin, for example, explores the micropolitics of international schools in terms of the metaphor of the vampire. And we can see that international schools are prone to micropolitics due to their inherent fragmentation. This fragmentation is caused by issues of identity, fear, and vulnerability. Meanwhile, Blythe's autoethnographic account of a contractual dispute paints a similarly bleak picture of the international school as somewhat Kafkaesque and labyrinthine in nature, with the individual teacher positioned and marginalized within an inscrutable and unfathomable social hierarchy. Finally, a number of studies have highlighted the precarious nature of international school teaching, arguing that the short-term and unpredictable nature of international schools creates uncertainty and insecurity, which impacts on teachers' sense of well-being. So this presentation will explore one aspect of the precaritization of international schooling, namely teachers' experiences of short-termism and short-term contracts, which I also refer to as international school short-termism. So I'd next like to say a little bit about teachers' contracts. So international school teachers are typically hired on contracts that are no more than 2 or 3 years in duration. We can see actually that the short-term nature of international school teaching is not isolated to international schools, but is actually part of a global discourse or phenomenon that presents the precaritization of life in terms of failure or a temporal state of risk. It can be seen that a great deal of the precarity I mentioned previously can be attributed to the short-term nature of teachers' contracts. So feelings of isolation, vulnerability as a result of the short-term nature of their contracts. However, recently, Tristan Bunnell of the University of Bath has called for a re-evaluation of the negative discourse on international schooling. So whilst it cannot be denied that international schools are precarious places, the almost exclusive focus on the negative has, I argue, precluded study of the positive. So this paper takes up Bunnell's call to develop a more positive sociology of international schooling by exploring the affordances that the short term can in fact hold for international school teachers. So in order to shift the focus from the negative to the positive, it's necessary to draw upon some new concepts. And these concepts I appropriate from the discipline of psychology, and namely positive psychology and the burgeoning concept of resilience capital, which is a concept that I've recently developed in a previous paper. I think this complements Bunnell's focus on developing a positive sociology of international schooling by proposing a positive psychology of international schooling. And a bit later in this presentation, I'll talk about how they complement each other. So, positive psychology. This has been proposed as a way to move beyond a deficit account of the individual. It's been argued that the individual, at least throughout the 20th century, has been seen as inherently broken and in need of repair and being fixed. Positive psychology assumes that individuals have already possess certain attributes and skills and resources that make them fundamentally competent. So for me, the notion of positive psychology resonates with Bunnell's call for a more positive lens of inquiry. So rather than viewing teachers, international school teachers, in deficit terms based on what they do not possess, for example, stable contracts or job security, or in some cases, not possessing a teaching qualification. Positive psychology reorientates our attention to what teachers do in fact possess. So most relevant to how teachers experience the short term is the notion of resilience, which is defined as the capacity to rebound or bounce back from adversity, conflict, failure, or even positive events, progress and increased responsibility. So this notion of resilience and the fact that teachers have these stores of resilience also connects with this idea of resilience capital, which I developed in a previous paper. So resilience capital has been proposed as a way to move beyond simply parsing the international school teacher experience into either positive or negative. So life is rarely black and white. What we see at the level of lived experience is the fact that dichotomous notions such as negative and positive not only become blurred, but they become intrinsically hybrid in nature. So what we see then is that developing the definition of resilience from positive psychology, not only do individuals possess these reserves of resilience, but by focusing on teachers' experiences of adversity and how they overcome them, we can actually see that simply saying positive and negative is not really nuanced enough, because at the level of lived experience, those distinctions break down. And what we need to do is reorientate ourselves to that lived experience. So in order to do this, I adopted phenomenological interviewing as the most appropriate method for data collection. This type of interviewing is particularly suited to capturing the nuance of lived experience and social reality, as this type of interview brings into focus the significations and meanings that individuals ascribe to their experiences. So there is the thing out there in the world as it is objectively, as it were. So we can talk about precarity or short-term contracts as a structural thing, which is out there in the world. And then we also need to attend to how individuals understand, experience, and navigate those structures. So because I'm interested in a psychological perspective, because I'm interested in developing more nuance, then I situate the unit of analysis as lived experience, and the phenomenological interview can actually give me some insight into that. So because, of course, we're interested in the meanings and significations that individuals ascribe to their experiences, I needed to ensure that personally salient accounts of richness and depth were actually kept. So I only focused on 6 teachers' interviews for this particular paper. Of course, this has implications for generalizability, but really what I'm doing with this paper is actually trying to look at individuals' experiences of the short term. Perhaps future papers could draw from a wider sample. And the interview data was analyzed inductively, so that generated codes from the data rather than imposing pre-existing themes or codes onto the data. And this actually generated the following themes. So we have flexibility, we have agency, we also have the metaphor of the safety valve, and finally resilience. So what I'd like to do now is explore some of the themes in more detail. It has to be pointed out, first of all, that the precarious side of short-term contracts was there in the data. So that has to be acknowledged right away. The negative was there. For example, Norman talked about the loss of expat privileges. As he says, well, Turkey had a 7-year rule. So some countries actually have this rule whereby if teachers have been there for, say, 7 to 10 years, then their contracts will change from expat to local contract. And a lot of the privileges that you get as an expat, for example, accommodation, medical, etc., you lose. And of course, the incentive to stay then is gone. And that actually generates short-termism because it effectively forces teachers to leave, to move on. There's also the emotional strain of having to renew contracts, and this came out in the interviews with Tyrone. And he says, if you don't perform, they're going to send you home. So the idea that you have to constantly renegotiate your contract every 2 to 3 years means there is this kind of tyranny of performativity that teachers have to constantly negotiate. I liken it to being in the arena. Now, Tristan Bunnell talks about the arena of international education, and I think we can extend the metaphor of the arena to having to do battle with this spectre of performativity, and that teachers, if they're not up to snuff, if they're not performing adequately, then their contracts will either be terminated or not renewed, and that does create a lot of anxiety and pressure. And of course, there's also the fact that you have long-term insecurity, and this is brought out by Sandy when she says, you don't have this long-term stability, they can sack you, they can end the contract, which certainly resonates with what Tyrone is saying. So the fear of not having that security, and this is in contrast, I think, to a lot of teaching jobs in national contexts, where in some countries, such as Germany, if you're a teacher, you're classed as a civil servant, so you basically have a job for life. And I believe this is the same situation in China. International schools are different. You get the perks and privileges of being an expat, but you don't necessarily get that long-term stability. So there's definitely a trade-off. However, by and large, the interview data pointed to short-term contracts as being actually quite positive in nature. So the first theme that emerged in terms of this positivity is flexibility. So short-term contracts offer teachers greater flexibility to be able to move on from a school if they don't like it. And this is illustrated by Sam when he says, having 2 years is copacetic for the employer and employee. From my perspective, it doesn't offer protection and job security, but it does give you the flexibility to search around if you don't like the school. And of course, the word but here signals that ambivalence. You have the benefits and the negatives, and that's a key thing that I'm trying to do with this study, is to get that nuance where the positives and the negatives coexist, and we see that with this extract. So I find the word copacetic very intriguing because this flexibility cuts both ways. It benefits the teacher because if they don't like the school, they can just endure a 2-year contract, which isn't really that long, and then choose to move on. In terms of the school, short-term contracts also are like a mechanism that schools can use to phase out teachers who are not performing adequately, or, as I found in some of my research, teachers who are rocking the boat, as it were, causing instability. That 2-year contract is a great get-out clause for both parties. But as alluded to already, when Sam mentioned the fact that it's copacetic, but it doesn't offer protection, we do find that you don't get that job security. So what we see is a more complex picture of the short term emerging. And this again is illustrated by Tyrone, who considers the flexible nature of short term contracts to actually be a potential difficulty. As he says, but I think if you stay at the school for only 1 or 2 years, you can get experience. But the disadvantage is you can't get into a routine. It's good to be in a routine. I like to stay at school quite a bit because it helps me to keep focused on my work. A disadvantage is the homesickness, missing my family. So actually, the short-term contract can give you some experience, but for teachers like Tyrone who are away from their families, they actually want to become more settled because the routine helps them to cope and deal with homesickness. So the familiarity of the day-to-day, building up that stability and routine, actually helps them deal with the emotional strain of being away from their family. But of course, the short-term nature of the job means that that stability is not guaranteed. And again, we can see this ambivalence being performed through the word but. This crops up frequently in these interviews, and it really signals the ambivalence of the short-term nature of these contracts. Another theme that emerged from the interviews was agency. And often we think of the short term as a lack of agency. But in fact, the participants talked about short-term contracts offering more choice, which can actually be empowering. And this is illustrated by Nora, who says, part of it is when you go into the international into international teaching, you know you have a bit of control over it. You can move somewhere new every 2 years. So actually, there is this idea of agency being limited. She says a bit of. You don't have absolute control because, of course, it's still a 2-year contract. But the short term is actually quite empowering because you have control. You can decide if you're going to move on, if your contract is going to be renewed, and you have choice. And these two actually are an example of agency, which is quite empowering. And Eva also mentioned something very similar, talking about the goal. Her goal at the moment is to experience a different culture, learn more, and then have good savings. I usually feel it in my soul, my heart, when it's time to move on, and I can see myself being here for at least another 2 years. So we can see that not only do we have agency, but that the short-term nature of the contracts also fosters mobility. So those short-term contracts become a way for, I would say, probably mostly younger teachers to hop from school to school in order to see the world. So I think perhaps the short-term nature of contracts are more disadvantageous to older teachers and certainly more advantageous to younger teachers. So there's an interesting distinction emerging there. And then we also have another theme, which is the metaphor of the safety valve. So actually, the short-term contract nature of the contract can also provide teachers with a sort of get-out clause. We also mentioned this previously, but I think the idea of a safety valve is an interesting metaphor. So it's a way to escape from schools whenever things get too difficult. And Norman talks about this when he says, I think that's a big problem with international schools. When we moved to Cambodia, we were fortunate. We've been fortunate in all 3 of the 5 schools we've taught in, and this school too, because we've hit the school on the way up as it's just hit rock bottom. So actually, the safety valve, like knowing when to leave the school, is actually a strategy. Teachers kind of get a sense of the rhythm of the rise and fall of schools, and then they leave a school on the way down and they try to join the school on the way up. So I think actually the idea of the safety valve becomes a strategy. And going hand in hand with this idea of knowing when to leave a school, or actually even experiencing adversity in schools, is the development of resilience. So all of these things we've talked about, the flexibility, the agency, the safety valve, they all contribute to the development of resilience. Okay? So we can actually see how teachers build up resilience. For example, Nora says, it is easier to put up with difficult situations since they are temporary. I can work anywhere for 2 years. Personally, though, I prefer to stay at least 4 years at any school. So she's talking about the fact that knowing that you're on a short-term contract can actually make you stronger because you can perhaps bear anything for a short amount of time. So that actually builds resilience. Sam says you have to just be a survivor. And I think this is resilience because it's the word just here gestures to this sort of grim social reality, and the teachers have to accept it. And by accepting it, they're able to actually become more resilient, and perhaps failure to accept that social reality will make teachers less resilient, and it will make it more difficult for them to actually to cope with the experience. Notice how Sam's word of just and survivor does paint that bleak picture of international schools as inherently precarious. This is not something that I deny. The precarity is there. It is true. Schools are inherently precarious. That's not under dispute. What is under dispute for me is that at the level of lived experience, when we take the unit of analysis as the individual and their experiences, we see a more complex picture emerging. We do have the precarity, but we also see how teachers are able to convert the negative into something more positive, which leads me to this notion of resilience capital. Nora, I think, really captures it very nicely, and her data really talks a lot about resilience. She says, I have enough international experience that I know to be tenacious. Teachers need to keep asking questions and looking for the right person to get some help. I think these situations always have made me stronger and better at navigating new schools. So this idea of tenacity, that because Nora's been on these short-term contracts, she's actually been in quite a few schools, she's actually learned, that you shouldn't give up, that you have to keep on fighting. And as she said, these situations have made us stronger. And this idea of like these experiences of adversity help you to navigate new schools. So resilience capital. It's a reserve of resilience that you're able to cash in the future when you move to a new school. And those short-term contracts, strangely enough, help you to build up that resilience because you experience different situations, different adversities, and they all contribute to making teachers more resilient and stronger. So when we look at these findings and we relate them to the literature, on the one hand, we do find that the findings reinforce this negative picture of international schools. As we saw that the participants' narratives do describe the short term in terms of uncertainty and anxiety, which does reflect previous studies. However, on the other hand, the findings suggest that something more subtle and nuanced is at work. Despite the short term being portrayed as failure or a temporal state of risk, the participants stress the positive aspects of being employed on short-term contracts. The findings also suggest that teachers' experiences of the short term are never simply positive or negative. So we should be very careful in how we describe the international school. We shouldn't be too hasty to say it's inherently precarious or negative, because we can see that teachers' experiences of precarity are more complex. So I think what this points to is the fact that we have what could be called structural precarity, which are the fact that international schools are inherently precarious, but we also need to recognize how individuals' experiences of structures modify how they act in relation to them. So in terms of what I think this paper contributes is it does develop to the literature on international school teachers by offering a positive psychology of international school teachers, which complements the positive sociology of international schooling. And this suggests a psychosocial lens of inquiry. So the sociology of international schooling is able to look at maybe the macro level or the meso level, the school. And the positive psychology lens is able to zoom in closer on the micro level. And I think they complement each other quite nicely. However, as I get to the end of this presentation, I feel the need to put the word positive under erasure in order to problematize its use. So I think in order to move from a negative approach to a more nuanced one, it is necessary to embrace the notion of the positive. So in order to actually to paint a clearer picture of the international school landscape, yes, we need to jump, as it were, from the negative to the positive. However, in doing so, I think we need to ensure that we do not simply move from one extreme position to another. So the use of sous-rature, or under erasure, forgive my French, is a reminder that, and perhaps even the warning, that existing concepts are not necessarily up to the task. And we need to develop new concepts that are able to capture the flux and flow of lived experience. So what I'm saying here is that it's a necessary step to jump from the negative to the positive. But by jumping from the negative to the positive, we may simply be reinscribing this kind of extreme polarization of the positive and the negative, of emotion. And what we need to do is to ensure that the unit of analysis actually is something between the two. So exploring the interplay of positive and negative will be the work of future publications. I think Resilience Capital suggests a way forward, but that concept as it stands is still needs refining. And I look forward to developing that concept in subsequent papers. So I'd just like to say thank you for watching my presentation, and I wish everyone the best. And if you have any ideas, any comments, feel free to email me and start a dialogue. Okay, thank you very much. 再见。